This is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. Hey everybody, it's Tony Kadasmati from the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, and today is volume 45, and it's part 2 of my short series entitled The Evolution of the American Counter-Revolution. Now, just to recap what happened in part 1 of this series, I outlined for you how the United States evolved from the founding until the early part of the 20th century. I tried to explain how the founders worried about the power of the central authority, but the Civil War and a more powerful central authority was required to end slavery. The Civil War happened because the framers left the question of slavery unresolved. They really didn't have much choice. I mean, the framers had to establish a nation, and the South just wasn't going to give up slavery and establish a nation. The question the war decided was where the dividing line was between the states' rights to govern themselves and the Constitution. And for the good of everybody, the Constitution won. Now today, this part is going to be entitled The Early 20th Century from Woodrow Wilson to Karl Marx. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American society was undergoing transformational change that was ushered in by the Industrial Revolution. The changes were profoundly affecting the way ordinary Americans lived and worked. Industrialization, the growth of cities, European immigration, and the emergence of captains of industry, and along with that, monopolistic corporate power, all demanded a reaction on the part of the government. Whenever there's profound changes occurring, such as those that were experienced at the turn of the 20th century, it isn't altogether surprising that those with unchecked power will tend to act in their own interest at the expense of others. In America, the unchecked power of business over labor led to labor organizing as a countervailing check on that power. Now, this was a natural consequence of the rapid development experienced at the time, but it wasn't painless, and it was violent and bloody. By 1900, and for about the previous 50 years from about 1850, new political and economic philosophies were becoming popularized. Two of the most prominent that we'll discuss here were progressivism and Marxism. Marxism is often called scientific socialism because it presumably is based on the scientific method and observation. Now, both ideologies saw themselves as new thinking, but they really were not new at all. It was the same old form of historical despotism. It was just cloaked in the phony and often discredited science of scientific socialism or progress. Progressives generally share the desire for central government to become or to be more activist in terms of addressing social problems and economic disparities. That is, their default position was 180 degrees out of phase with what the founders and the framers believed was the proper role of the federal government. Whether they were Marxist adherents to the philosophy of scientific socialism or they were progressives, both of these veins of thought were counter-revolutionary ideas to the American Revolution. The danger in them was their capitulation to the ancient fear the framers labored so long to avoid. And what was that fear? An all-powerful central government. Now, while some right progressives settled in the Republican Party, Marxists and leftist progressives found their home in the Democratic Party. Now, who were the right progressives? People like Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. And the left progressives were people like Woodrow Wilson. In 1917, after the success of the Russian Revolution and the rise of a government based on the principles of scientific socialism, the Western democracies, including the United States, experienced a Red Scare. The threat of international communism, however, was blunted at the time because it was recognized as atheistic and antithetical to any of our founding American principles. For that part of the 20th century, that part between the Russian Revolution and the outbreak of the Second World War, Russian communism was only a curiosity to some Americans on the political left in that Soviet experiment. Left progressives, however, were an entirely different matter. The election of Woodrow Wilson became a watershed moment in the counter-revolution against the principles of the American founding. Wilson thought the Constitution was deficient for modern-day 20th century America and proposed a new set of rights. The Constitution has often been referred to as a charter of negative rights. The word negative here is not used to connote something bad. Rather, the Constitution sets out to limit government because the framers of the Constitution believed the enemy of liberty and human freedom was a government without any limiting principles. The rights outlined in the Constitution set forth limitations on government that our framers believed were essential for the continuation of the Republic. Wilson believed, however, that the Constitution should also contain a charter of positive rights. That is, rights you are entitled to and provided to you by the government. Wilson believed this was necessary in order to perfect the American experiment. However, I believe Wilson was grievously in error. One problem with positively stated rights, and there are a lot of problems with them, is that they are a zero-sum game in rights overall, especially in the American system, where we believe in private property. For example, a positively stated right might be expressed as follows, quote, "Every American has the right to health care," unquote. But in order to secure this right for every American, the government must acquire property, that is, money, and it must do that from someone who has it, and it has to do it through compulsion of taxation. In other words, the government must somehow deprive someone of their rights in order to fund the right to health care. Now, nothing can really be a right if it requires some to lose their rights in order for others to gain rights. Another problem with positively stated rights is they're subject to the discretion and definition of those in government holding the power to define what those rights mean in real terms. If the government determines, for example, that an 80-year-old man diagnosed with cancer should not be treated for the disease because resources are limited and they are needed to treat others who are younger and more productive, haven't the health care rights of the 80-year-old been violated simply because a faceless government bureaucrat has decided resources can't be provided to treat him? This becomes an exercise in dehumanizing people. That is what the framers feared. The bastardization of their ideas and their hopes for America. The greater the power and scope of the federal government, there is an associated diminishing of importance of the individual and individual freedom. Moreover, a nation also experiencing robust growth in its population, either through immigration and or birth rates, will also experience a dilution in representation. Here's what I mean by that. In current-day America, each member of the House of Representatives has approximately 725,000 constituents in their district, nearly 750,000 people. In 1967, 50 years ago, the average was 460,000, more than a third less. Now, this makes the case even more powerful for the framers that the government that governs best is the one that's closest to the people, which is the whole motivation underlying the notion of allowing states the right to govern themselves. Today's progressives believe even the use of the phrase state rights is code for racism, white supremacy, segregation, and slavery. And it was admittedly used in that context by segregationists, but that was over 50 years ago. The concept of states' rights was never intended to be so one-dimensional. In a country growing dramatically in population, the concept of empowering state and local governments to govern themselves with the sole limitation that they must adhere to the supremacy of federal law and guaranteeing the constitutional and civil rights of all of its citizens makes for a more representative government, not a less representative government. So the fear-mongering by the new left terrifies people into believing that expanding the rights of states and localities to govern themselves will somehow usher in the same atrocious behavior witnessed more than 2 generations ago. Oddly, while the progressive left says they believe in progress and change, they are shown herein to really deny the progress and change they themselves were successful in achieving. I'd also like to add one final note. The left progressives and Marxists pretend they're going to save us from the tyranny of local government. They are doing no such thing. The troubles associated with the rights of states, which led to the Civil War and post-war disenfranchisement of blacks in the South, was a battle fought and won a long time ago. America today is several generations removed from that era. Attitudes have changed. As I sit here in the year of our Lord, 2017, there is nobody under 55 years of age that ever knew a time prior to the Civil Rights Act. Blacks are no longer systematically disenfranchised as a race, while the new left attempts to convince people that not much has changed since the Jim Crow and segregation era. Their audience is a country comprised mostly of people who have no living memory of those abuses to make any sort of an honest comparison or judgment. The result is a leftist sleight of hand that forces people into trading victory for defeat, convincing them that the dead tyrants of the past will somehow resurrect themselves to threaten their liberty anew, while accepting into their midst the ubiquitous dragon our forefathers endlessly warned us about, the growing power of the central government. That's it for this podcast and this episode of The Evolution of the American Counter-Revolution. I'm Tony Codispoti. Thanks for listening.